Okay, welcome to U.S. History. This is Mr. Carter, your teacher, and I'm going to be introducing this new unit of study. This is Lesson 2. Here at the beginning of the school year, we're going to be looking at the actual study of history. The study of history, which seems a little odd, but essentially is the idea of how do we go through a course with the right attitude and with some common goals associated with what we want to get out of this. Now you may say, well, the goal is I want to pass this thing so I can graduate from high school, and that's a fair goal. You certainly can have that one. I would have that one too if I was a high school student. But if we can go a little bit deeper and try to get something out of it, I think that would be great too. One of the things that always frustrates me as a history teacher is that students find history to be incredibly boring oftentimes. And I think the reason for that is not, as was listed in the introduction of this lesson, not the study of history, but actually the way it is presented to you. So the hope is that over the course of this semester and year, we're going to break out of that a little bit by trying to find some relevance. In other words, trying to find a place where you can find value with what you're studying. Nothing wrong with having the goal being I'd like to get a credit, I'd like to get a good grade, but if we can find some value out of this class too, then we all win. So that'll be the goal as we are collectively working our way through this year, and it's also going to be the short-term goal of this lesson is really trying to put some sort of a frame around what we're studying this term. So a fair question that comes up a lot with students is, why do we study history these days? When I can go in and I can look up anything I want on Google or any other search site on my phone that I carry around with me, and I can pull up thousands of bit of information, every fact I could ever want about, as in it shows in this picture on the right-hand side, the U.S. Civil War. I can absolutely get all the data that I want. Why should I study it? Cram my head full of facts and figures when I can just look that information up? And that's a fair question, I think. And it goes back to the way that we have been teaching history more than the rationale for studying history. If history has just been a recitation of facts and figures that you kind of stuff into your brain and that you then regurgitate on some sort of a test or essay, then I think that there's some validity in that question. Why on earth do I study this when I can just look it up? If we go a little bit deeper and try to figure out what history does, then I think we have a better idea of finding some value in it and to see how it supports the ability to look up facts as opposed to is just a useless way to stuff our head full of facts. So let's look at some of the reasons. I've got 4 reasons here that I think are important as to why we study history. The first one is that it helps us understand people and societies outside of our own situation. So outside of our own family, outside of our own community, outside of our own state, and even outside of our own country, everybody has a unique history. And if we understand a little bit about that history, we have a better idea of being able to communicate, being able to work, being able to socially function with other people from around the world and around our country. For example, people in the South have a unique history that is very different than people in the West or the North. That impacts the way that they act. It impacts the way that they interact with others and their worldview. And without understanding a little bit about why that is, we have a hard time communicating, and oftentimes we get ourselves into conflict. And so that's one way. Another reason is that history provides a personal identity. We all have a personal history that comes down to us. We are who we are for a reason. And the answering the question, who are you, is all about history. Okay, who are your parents? Where did they come from? Why did they come to Las Vegas? As a matter of fact, you're going to be looking at that as part of this lesson. So trying to get an idea of who you are as a person is just as important as trying to figure out who we are as a society. The third bullet is that studying history is essential for good citizenship. For you to be a citizen of the United States, and even a citizen of the world, if you want to think of it that way, we have to understand a little bit about our history. We can't just roll into voting without understanding a little bit of the history. We can't be a good contributing member of society without understanding what's come before and why we are the way we are. And so studying history helps you become an adult and helps you become a good citizen. And then the quote that is often, it's a bit of a cliche, it's used in almost every history class, but it has some validity, and that is, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And this is a simplification. we can use the concept of war. Even if we study war to understanding that we have everything down, why war happens, what was the conflict, sadly there are still going to be military conflicts in the world. We're not going to stop that from occurring. But we might have a better idea of the history that makes our current present the way it is. And so understanding the past is really important for us to understand the present. So if we look at this particular class, how are we going to redefine the study of history in this course to make it a little bit more interesting to you, hopefully, and more applicable to what I just said on the last slide, making it relevant. And so redefining it, we're going to look at a couple of things. So we're going to focus less on facts and a very hardcore timeline in this class. We're still going to have some information. Obviously, you're still going to read things. It's going to have stuff. You're going to be called on those kind of things in terms to be able to remember those. But my goal is not for you to remember little factoids. What was the date of this battle? What was the middle name of this president? Those are the things that we can look up on Google, as we talked about before. And then a rigid timeline, going from idea to idea to idea, just because it happened chronologically, is not necessarily the best way to go. So we're going to be looking more at thematic themes or big ideas and trying to call those together with what happened in history and what's happening today. We're also going to focus more on drawing conclusions and making connections. So connecting what happened in history to what's happening now. What happened in history to what happened maybe later in history. How did this occur? So what happened in the civil rights era that we can look back on into the Civil War? How are those connected, and what did that lead to? And then also drawing conclusions. And that's higher order thinking, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but really looking back and saying, okay, I've understood this history. How can I figure out what it means? What does this history mean? And then we're going to focus more on the concept of relevance, which really means connecting it to you. So how does history impact me? That's what we're going to look at, and hopefully that will make it a little more interesting to you than just, like I said, regurgitation of facts and figures. The quote here is a really good one, I think, that learning history is easy, but learning its lessons seems almost impossibly difficult. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to do, or at least attempt to do, the second part of that, is try to learn history's lessons. The last bullet on the slide we just went through was the concept of relevance. So let's talk about that a little bit. How do we make history relevant to you as a student and you as a 21st century American? We have to understand what it tells us about ourselves, as I talked about before. Our own story, how is that impacted by what's happened in the United States and what's happened to the world in order to get you to where you are in 2000 and whatever as a young person in Las Vegas, Nevada. What does history tell us about others? That's the concept of trying to understand other societies, other people, other parts of the country, other parts of the world are impacted by their history, and so trying to understand that will help make history relevant as well. How can history help us plan for the future? Those seem to be two strange things. We're looking at the past to try to inform the future, but that's a little bit back to the idea of the condemned to repeat it concept, that you have to understand what's happening in the past because that will impact what happens in the future. Our relationship as United States with other countries is totally based on the history of what's happened between the United States and that country. Our relationship with different people in different parts of our own country is based on that history, and we'll look up that too. And then the last one is really the concept of keeping the story in history. History is really vibrant and really interesting, and as I showed in that introduction to this lesson, we know that because half the movies that we ever watch are all about history, and they make a bunch of money. So there's a current movie out right now called Dunkirk, which is, very, very popular in the movie theaters. It's about a historical event. So the story of history is interesting to people. The facts that are just kind of basic and can be looked up elsewhere sometimes are not. And so we're going to try to really focus on the story, what's happening that's making it interesting. And I have a picture here on the right-hand side. It's the playbill for the play that's actually coming to the Smith Center here in the end of this year. But it's called Hamilton. Hamilton is a play about the very beginning of our country and a guy named Alexander Hamilton, who was really important in founding the United States. But it's an updated version. It's a musical. It involves a very ethnically diverse cast, and it's a revision of history to some extent, and looking at the story as opposed in a different way. And so that's kind of our concept too. We're also going to be delving into something called higher order thinking, the concept that you have to be thinking a little deeper than basic recall. So a lot of history classes have been, as I've said before, here's some facts, memorize those facts, spit those facts back out to me. And while I do think that there are some basic things that you should know, it would be important for you to know that the Civil War happened before the Vietnam War, for example. It would be important for you to understand that the Revolutionary War led to the writing of the Constitution and things of that sort. So there is a timeline that's important here, but generally it's the deeper thinking that's important. And so the big four things that we're going to try to do in this class are application, so developing some knowledge and then doing something with it, trying to figure out what do we need to do with this history, how can we take it and learn from it. That's going to be important. Connecting, tying bits of information together to make more sense. So if I look at the civil rights movement and then I look at another issue, how do those tie together? How can I connect those logically? Critiquing, and that's making an evaluation based on something. So essentially developing an opinion, and then more importantly than just having an opinion is being able to defend that opinion. That's being a critic or critiquing. And then analyzing. That's to interpret information in a methodological detail. And so was us being able to look through and understand something and see what it is that it's trying to tell us, and that's analysis. So that we'll be doing all those higher order thinking. A lot of those will involve writing, some of those will involve projects, but you'll have a hand in deciding how you want to deal with most of those things. So there's really two ways these days to teach history. One is called thematic and one is called chronological. Most classes in the history of teaching history have been chronological. The idea that we start at the beginning and we walk our way through to the very end. So that's been kind of the concept that we've done before, the chronological approach. Thematic approach is kind of a new way of looking at it, and that is taking big ideas and working them all the way through history in a little bit more of a disconnected way. So we might look at the concept of freedom, or we might look at the concept of work and industry, or we might look at the concept of what is it like to be an immigrant in the United States. So looking at those all the way through as opposed to just focusing on jumping from concept to concept. In this class, we're going to try to do a little bit of both. We're going to do the kind of right in the middle, where we're going to be looking deeper at some specific themes and case studies. Those are individual kind of stories within history that explain big ideas. But we're also going to be working our way chronologically through to some extent as well. So we're going to try to find a happy medium between these two ways of teaching history, and hopefully that'll be interesting to you. So what are we going to use for resources? There's really in history, there's two main things that we use. One is called primary sources, and the second one is called secondary sources. Very, very thoughtful ideas of how to name these two things. And I'm going to jump to the second one first. So secondary sources are the ones that mostly people have used in the past when studying history. This is information that was created by someone after the fact who did not experience firsthand or participate in the concept that happened, whatever it was. So the event that may have occurred, somebody wrote about it afterwards. These are things like textbooks, scholarly books, articles that have been written by historians. In school, it's usually the textbook. And we will use a textbook. Well, that'll be kind of our anchor that'll guide us through and give us some good information. But what I want to focus more on is the first, which is called primary sources. And primary sources are things that were published or created at the time of an event. So letters from person to person, diaries, interviews, court records, maps, even things like clothing and music and things like that are primary sources. And the reason that those are important, newspaper articles are a critical one too. The reason that those are important is that they haven't been interpreted by someone else. If I write a book about the U.S. Civil War, and obviously I was not around during the U.S. Civil War, I am bringing in my biases and my ideas of what happened and putting them on a page. I can't help but do that. but things that are happening at the time are not tainted that way quite as much. And so primary sources give us a good view as to what was happening during the time frame, and that's going to be really important. So primary sources will be the main way that we'll be looking at history, and then the secondary sources, predominantly our textbook, will be kind of our guide and our anchor as we work our way through methodically. What I want you to do by the end of this class is develop something called historical literacy. So literacy, that as a concept is the idea of being able to read, being able to interpret things. When we add the word historical to it, it just means understanding history at some bit of a deeper level. And to do that, we have a few things we need. We need some basic knowledge, as I talked about before. Even though we don't want to just be overwhelmed and totally burdened and bored by facts, there's some basic knowledge that's important for, I think, all Americans to know about the history of their country. And so we're going to be going through a few of those things. I'm not interested as much on this exact date or this exact title. I want you to understand basic themes of history. So being able to have that kind of a conversation is important. And then what I want you to do is think a little bit deeper about history and understand that there are some inherent biases in history. And the quote that is over on the right-hand side from Winston Churchill, who was the Prime Minister of Great Britain during the Second World War, is a great one. "History will be kind to me," he said, "for I intend to write it." And so, this is an important concept for us to understand, is that history is written by somebody. And chances are they're going to add their biases to that history. So we have to be aware and try to figure out how we can find those truths. To use the terminology of today, history sometimes can be the original fake news. History doesn't necessarily match with what happened on the ground. Sometimes that's because there's no record of it. People going back to really early prehistory have to make some logical guesses because there's no record of what happened. Sometimes it's done intentionally, where people want to make sure that it's skewed in a way that answers their question the way that they want it. And so what I want you to do is be savvy enough to be able to, to figure out, using some of those higher order thinking skills, what are truths, okay? Part of that is evaluating sources, being able to look at a source and say, this is a valid source for me to use, or this is biased, but I recognize the bias, and so I can work my way through it. Okay? Interpreting history, we've talked a lot about that, and then also civic engagement, being able to use history to become a better citizen as you are approaching adulthood. With all that, where do we go from here? So this is kind of the how do we wrap this particular lesson up. What this study is going to look like for semester 1 is really kind of providing a base, which is what we're doing right now, kind of an introduction and studying, the concept of studying history to get you ready for the study that we're going to do over the course of this year. Then we're going to focus a little bit on the interplay between the people and the land. Okay, this is the geography piece, if you want to think of it that way. How do the people of the United States, and how have they interacted with the land, and how has the land interacted and created the history that is what we see today? There's huge value in understanding that, and so we're going to start with that. Our third unit is going to be really looking back at some things that you have learned. It's been probably a couple years since you've done this, but kind of the birth of our nation, the foundations of the United States up until about the year 1900, and really kind of looking at those critical elements that happened during that time frame. Our colonization, Native Americans, we'll be looking for sure at the colonial experience, as we essentially worked our way to becoming our own nation through the Revolutionary War and the construction of our Constitution. The interplay in early America, trying to understand who we are, developing land, the Civil War, Reconstruction, all those things, industrialization, will be stuff that we'll study very quickly in Unit 3. Then in Unit 4, we'll really look at when the United States broke out of becoming kind of its own nation, focused on its own internal issues, to becoming a world power and jumping onto the world stage and becoming a big player with, in those days, the larger countries in the world like Russia and France and the United Kingdom. and how that occurred and what that meant for us. And then we'll finish up this semester with looking at the concept of boom and bust, the business and innovation, ultimately leading to the Great Depression and right up to World War II. And so that'll be kind of our the time frame that we're looking at. As I said, we won't go through it just simply chronologically, but that gives you at least a framework for what we're going to study. So for now, go back into the lesson. Take a look at the other elements of the lesson, the other materials that you'll need. There's some readings. And then you're going to go ahead and take a shot at the lesson assignment for Lesson 2. Obviously, if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. And I look forward to working with you as we work through the study of history.